Hello, everybody. Welcome back to AP World History. This is Unit 8/9. This is going to be Chapter 2. We're going to look at the non-aligned world today. But considering kind of the lessons from last presentation, what is the experience of Latin America, Africa, and Asia during the Cold War? You should consider that idea of proxy war, just as a big hint. So today we're going to talk about the non-aligned nations of the world. Today we're going to look at East Asia. Then we'll look at the Middle East. And then in our future presentations, we'll look at Africa. Then we'll look at Latin America as well. So let's take a look at our lesson objectives today. Well, you're going to be able to compare the ways in which the US and the Soviet Union sought to maintain influence over the course of the Cold War. You're going to be able to explain the causes and consequences of China's adoption of communism. We'll take a look at that today. And then you're going to be able to explain the causes and effects of movements to redistribute economic resources. Also consider with this kind of question, movements to distribute social hierarchy, or to break down social hierarchies, to break down environmental hierarchies as well. So today we're going to focus on this topic, this concept of the Cold War and its relation with the so-called Third World. The Third World is the name that we typically give to non-industrialized countries. They are primarily countries of Latin America, of Africa, and of East Asia. But these also are countries, and more accurately, these are countries that aren't allies with either the Soviets or the Americans. They are neutral during the Cold War. They will probably not, in many cases, have alliances directly with either the Americans or the Soviets. And as a part of this, these countries of the Third World, they're largely going to form their own economic paths as well. They are going to have their own forms of economics. Sometimes it's a mix between capitalism and communism. And that's something you should kind of keep in the back of your mind as we go forward. Typically, these are developing nations, meaning they are pre-industrial economies, but we are going to see how there is a degree of industrialization during this time by the present day. And these countries are going to kind of form organizations to counterbalance the impact of the Soviets and the Americans, the First and the Second World. And that is going to be expressed in the non-aligned movement. This is an organization of states that aren't allies with either the Soviets or the Americans. But kind of a way that the Cold War will impact these countries, not only through the organization of things like the non-aligned movement, but also we're going to see how there is an impact of these so-called proxy wars. We are going to see the Soviets and the Americans try and spread their influence in the Third World by backing up opposing sides in these countries. We are going to see regional wars across the Third World in places like Africa and places like the Middle East, where we are going to see both superpowers, the Soviets and the Americans, backing up different groups. The United States is largely going to back up anybody that isn't a communist or is against the interest of anyone that is against the interest of the Americans. So we are going to see the Americans sponsoring anti-communist movements around the world. We're going to see the training of anti-communist militaries in places like Iran, in Guatemala, in places like the Philippines, in places like South Vietnam. And we're also going to see the US using its intelligence agencies to overthrow, in many cases, democratically elected socialist countries. We are going to see the CIA being used in Iran in 1953. We're going to see the CIA in Guatemala in 1954. And we'll discuss these examples more later on. But it is an example of these proxy wars, the frequent use of CIA intervention by the United States. The Soviets, they are also going to train anti-capitalist movements, so communist insurgencies around the world. We're going to see that in places like Angola. We'll discuss that more with our fourth chapter of this unit. We'll also see the invasion of places that are slipping in their communist control, places like Afghanistan, and we'll talk about that more in a second. but as a result of kind of two processes during the Cold War. One, decolonization, and two, proxy wars, which again, mostly impacting the third world. We are going to see an increase of violence, of political instability in the international community during the Cold War and beyond. And as a result, we're going to see more wars in the 20th century, primarily done in the third world, either as a result of decolonization or these Cold War proxy wars. And as a result, we are going to see increased instances of mass atrocities committed around the world. And the examples I'm going to talk about in just a second, largely as a result of either decolonization or of these proxy wars between the Americans and the Soviets. And kind of pay attention, not necessarily to what's happening. Yes, pay attention to what's happening, but kind of how either decolonization or a proxy war is impacting these places. Well, kind of an early example of decolonization is actually in Ireland. Ireland is going to be a country that was ruled over by the British since, well, the 1500s, really. But by the 1920s, we are going to see increased Irish nationalism. We are going to see Ireland win its independence by the 1920s. However, the problem is that part of Ireland, the northern part of it, is going to be continually occupied by the British. The British, primarily Protestant, Irish Catholics. In the south, well, they're mostly Catholic. So we see with the remaining British presence that there is going to be remaining sectarian conflict, that there is going to be religious conflict between Protestants and Catholics in Ireland as a result of decolonization. And this is going to go on really until the end of the 20th century, until the so-called Good Friday Agreement. And we don't really talk about that all that much. But the thing to take away is how decolonization is leading to religious violence. Another way that we're seeing increased violence during this time is through proxy wars, especially how proxy wars tend to spill over into different countries. For instance, Cambodia. Cambodia is the next door neighbor to Vietnam, which, as you remember, is going to have a proxy war there in the Vietnam War between the US and the Soviets through their support of both sides during the Vietnam War. But the war is going to spill over into Cambodia. The United States is going to conduct a bombing campaign against Cambodia out of the suspicion that they are assisting the northern Vietnamese. But this is going to have the impact of political instability, and it is going to see the rise of a communist party in the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge, an extremely repressive communist party in Cambodia. It will see mass atrocities being committed against Cambodians. We will see the so-called killing fields where thousands of Cambodians are murdered by this new regime. The new regime headed by a guy by the name of Pol Pot, P-O-L-P-O-T. So the Khmer Rouge is an example of kind of the impact of these proxy wars. We are seeing the rise of dictators, essentially. But we're also going to see other violence that is kind of an impact of the Cold War, either through these proxy wars, as we'll see on the last example, or by decolonization. So let's look at this example of violence after decolonization, and that is going to happen in Rwanda. Rwanda was a Belgian colony. Well, at first it was a German one, but eventually it became a Belgian one after World War I. And really, while the Belgians and the Germans were there, these European powers encouraged racial and ethnic hierarchies. And in Rwanda's case, it was a hierarchy between the Hutu and the Tutsi. The Tutsi are a minority in Rwanda, but they were viewed kind of as the preferred minority by the Belgians especially. So colonial government largely staffed by the Tutsi at the expense of the majority Hutus. But when Rwanda gets its independence by the 1960s, everything is kind of going in reverse. The Tutsi, they are the minority without any real power. Then we have the Hutu on top who have the power, so to say. And we are going to see increased kind of Hutu nationalism that is going to eventually spill over into outright policies of genocide. We are going to see well after independence, but as a result of political instability from decolonization, we are going to see a genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda by 1994. If you've seen the film Hotel Rwanda, if you've read the book, you're kind of getting a picture of this violence as a result of decolonization. And the picture I have right here, very famous image from a museum in Cambodia, actually, it looks like, kind of representing the impact of the Khmer Rouge. But another instance of ethnic violence that's going to come as a result of the end of the Cold War, the breakup of a country called Yugoslavia in the Balkans. We are going to see genocide there as well. In the Balkans, we have Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was a communist country and is comprised of different ethnic groups on the Balkan Peninsula, groups like Serbians, groups like Slovenians, groups like Bosnians. And they're kind of held together by the leader of Yugoslavia, a guy by the name of Tito, who we talked about in World War II, actually. But Tito is going to eventually die, and there is going to be instability in Yugoslavia. That's going to be intensified by the end of the Cold War, by the fall of communism in the USSR. And that's going to lead to conflict in Yugoslavia after it breaks up. We are going to see ethnic violence break out between Serbs, who are mostly Eastern Orthodox Christians, and Bosnians, who are mostly Muslims. So we are seeing ethnic violence in the Balkans as a result of how the Cold War played out and how it eventually ended with the breakup of Yugoslavia. So you should be able to give examples of first, second, and third world countries, kind of call back to your notes for the first presentation. And you should also kind of look at some examples of proxy wars during the Cold War. And we've discussed a few. And kind of what is the result of all of this instability during the Cold War, either through proxy wars or through decolonization. Oh my God, there we go. So let's first look at East Asia real quick. We're gonna look at Japan, China, and other countries of East Asia. And we're gonna primarily focus on the idea of industrialization. That's what you should kind of pay attention to. So let's look at Japan first. Japan is going to experience a post-war economic recovery. It's called a miracle by historians because of how quickly it is and how rapid it is. But how are we getting there? Well, for one thing, we are going to see how the US is going to be instrumental in rebuilding Japan's economy. Remember, during World War II, the Allies, namely the US, largely destroyed urban centers across Japan through those firebombing campaigns, through the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But to kind of create a reindustrialized Japan for the interest of preventing the spread of communism, especially when China becomes communist by 1949, we are going to see the United States provide a lot of military and political assistance and economic assistance to rebuild Japan's economy. So first things first, the United States, they're going to occupy Japan, and the occupying government is going to help Japanese politicians draft a new constitution, a liberal parliamentary government, one in which we have a democracy where there's political parties. The emperor is still in charge, technically, but he's not as important as he was during, say, World War II. On top of that, we're also going to see the Constitution greatly reducing the size of the Japanese military, greatly reducing the political role of the military. Japan's military protection largely going to be provided in a way by the United States. So really, we are seeing the building of a liberal style government, again, to prevent the spread of capitalism, or the opposite, to prevent the spread of communism. But let's take a look at what's going on economically, because again, the United States is going to majorly invest in Japan to prevent, again, the spread of communism. We are going to see Japan focus on rebuilding its industrial infrastructure, say its electric grid. We're going to see the building of coal plants, of oil plants, eventually nuclear power plants. And this is going to provide the energy needed to rebuild Japan's industrial economy, namely the automobile industry, namely ships, namely steel production. So Japan is going to have a very strong capitalist economy as a result of all of these rebuilding efforts. Japan is also going to majorly call out and reach out, build up diplomatic and trade relations with capitalist nations in the West, namely the United States, but also places like South Korea, places like Singapore and Hong Kong. So we're seeing the expansion of trade. This is leading to increased prosperity in Japan. We're going to see not really a communist movement emerge there. Japan is going to experience a depression in the 1990s, but other than that, things are going pretty well in Japan, even to this day. It's a major industrial power. It's competing with the United States. It's competing with Western Europe for economic dominance. Let's turn our attention now to China. And China will remain a communist country, I will state that. But it is going to transition and experiment with this idea of communism, as we're going to see. But let's first look at how communism is implemented in China. Well, by 1949, Mao Zedong, the leader of the Communist Party, he's going to come into power after winning in the Chinese Civil War, which we discussed last unit. So in 1949, Mao wins. He becomes the leader of China, a communist nation. And in 1949, he's going to develop close relations with Joseph Stalin. Stalin is kind of his political icon, his political model, so to say. So Mao is going to form very close relations diplomatically with the Soviet Union, but also economically as well. Mao is going to try and replicate Stalin's program of industrialization in China. And he's going to do that through a process known as the Great Leap Forward. This essentially is China's Mao's version of the 5-year plans that Stalin did. And we are going to see very similarly this attempt to industrialize a pre-industrial economy. We are going to see Mao initiate that kind of 3-step program we looked at with Joseph Stalin. He's going to centralize power politically. He is going to collectivize agriculture. And he is also going to try and build up China's industrial infrastructure. So let's take a look at the results of this. Well, even though the intention is going to be to industrialize China, it's largely going to fail. And it's going to fail for really 2 reasons and in 2 major areas. So for one thing, we are going to see China fail in the collectivization program. We are going to see a famine in China. We are going to see in the Great Chinese Famine during the Great Leap Forward, a massive amount of deaths in this failed collectivization program. We are going to see estimates range. It's kind of wacky how these estimates range in a way, between 15 million people and 55 million people. It's a huge amount of people lost, even at the lowest end. On top of that, we are going to see a failure to industrialize in China. We are going to see kind of haphazard construction of major industrial centers in China. Some of them are going to collapse. For instance, dams across China are going to collapse. But we're also going to see very failed steel production as well. Literally, it's so haphazard that people are making steel in their backyards. That's how all over the place all of this Great Leap Forward truly is. So it's largely a failure. However, Mao is going to largely blame counter-revolutionaries for this defeat, because there is going to be an atmosphere in China that Mao is losing his grip. So Mao is going to realize, hey, I need to reassert political control to make people believe in my program, my idea of Maoism. So Mao is going to kind of initiate a shift in Chinese history known as the Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution is going to be a vast period of Chinese history where Mao is trying to fundamentally change Chinese culture to practice his ideas of communism. He's going to first do that by rooting out suspected counter-revolutionaries in the Chinese Communist Party. He is going to purge the CCP of people who are supposedly anti-Mao. But furthermore, Mao is going to encourage revolutionary values among China's youth population. He's trying to make a political base that is loyal to, well, him, unquestionably loyal to Mao Zedong. And that's going to be seen through the promotion of these so-called Red Guard. The Red Guard are student organizations, college-age student organizations, who are going to go around China and try and establish the presence of Maoist thought around China. These Red Guards, they are going to initiate public shaming campaigns against their teachers who, well, hopefully you guys don't do this to me, against their teachers who are supposedly professing anti-Maoist views. You are going to see some executions taking place in China against these supposed counter-revolutionaries. We have a cult of personality really forming around the character of Mao Zedong as a result of the Cultural Revolution. Chinese history is going to try and be altered. We are going to see the elimination of Chinese history in China. Anything that resembles the old dynastic order is going to be purged by these Red Guard. So we are seeing a very rapid change in Chinese society to encourage a unquestioning loyal subjects in China, all organized under the direction of Mao. And really, Mao is going to say that we need this in order to industrialize. We need to absolutely purge the traditional past in order to fully become a communist nation. So we are going to see people who are criticized for quote unquote bourgeois values, as I said before. We have the deaths of 3 million people, that's the high end. We have the beatings and public executions of individuals. And really, it is going to be kind of something that is going to impact the Chinese society, really, until this day. Mao is held up as a extremely influential figure, even though the party, the Communist Party, is kind of drifting away from him by his death in the 1970s. The Cultural Revolution only dies when Mao dies. So really, we are seeing this transformation of Chinese society under Mao to bring about a more centralized political system to encourage industrialization. But Mao is also going to shift China's relation towards other communist countries around the world. In the 1950s, we are going to see China move away from its close alliance with the Soviets. We are going to see by the 1950s the Sino-Soviet split. We are going to see that largely occur for two reasons. Stalin's going to die in 1953. Remember, Mao really likes Stalin. Mao is going to say, I don't like Khrushchev and all of his de-Stalinization. So we're going to see a moving away as a result of de-Stalinization in the Soviet Union. We're also going to see this accusation that the Soviets are engaged in Western-style imperialism, telling the Chinese what to do, essentially. And Mao is going to incorporate his ideas of Maoism by encouraging Maoist revolutions around the world. He wants to build up foreign alliances by building revolutionary activity and movements around the world. So Mao is going to promote guerrilla warfare in the third world, primarily in Africa and Latin America. But Mao is also going to kind of drift away from the Cold War split between the Soviets and the Americans by forming his own economic and diplomatic ties with countries like the United States, the supposed enemy of communism. In 1972, Richard Nixon, the president of the United States, he's going to visit China. And we are going to see the establishment of full diplomatic ties between the Chinese and the Americans as a result of this visit. So really, we're seeing a shift in kind of the direction of making China a non-aligned country. So that's kind of what is shifting in Chinese history right now. However, even more shifts are going to happen to the Chinese economy. By 1976, Mao is going to die. And as a result of his death, we are going to see changes in China. We are going to see people trying to deconstruct the cult of personality around Mao. That's largely not going to work. But what is going to work is relaxing Mao's government's control over the Chinese economy. That's going to be seen with Mao's successor, this guy in the cowboy hat, a guy by the name of Deng Xiaoping. Deng is going to be a reformer in Chinese history. He's kind of like Lenin in a way, at least with the new economic policy. So remember the new economic policy in the Soviet Union, that's allowing for private property, it's allowing for more free market principles. And that is basically what Deng is introducing to Chinese economic history. He is going to relax government control of the economy. He is opening up the possibility for private property ownership. We are going to see the promotion of the free market in China. We are also going to see Chinese markets opening up to Western countries, towards capitalist countries. And we're primarily seeing that in the development of a new kind of theory in Chinese economic history known as state capitalism. So it's kind of what we would call a mixed economy. On the one hand, you have state planning, primarily of government control of key industries, but we also have a degree of free market enterprise, of free market principles. So there really are two sections of the Chinese economy. There's the one that's more driven by international markets. We have China opening up to the West. But the other side is more domestic kind of industry, kind of still government planned, but the products are released on a free market basis. So we're seeing the kind of transition away from a more planned economy, a more Soviet-style economy, towards one that is more open for free market principles, a mixed economy. And the impact of this is going to be almost immediate. We look here at these two graphs. This first one is going to show how we see a massive increase in gross domestic product in China. We are going to see increased prosperity, increased industrial production as a result of Deng's reforms in the 1970s. In the 1990s, China is going to join the international world market. That's how successful these reforms are. And even to this day, China is becoming a major industrial world power, one that could, in some economists' forecasts, going to outpace the United States. So as a result of these economic reforms, we are going to see political reforms as well. In 1982, we see a new constitution, one that is opening up the Chinese market, one that is increasing industrial production, increasing prosperity. So China is going to emerge as a fully industrialized nation by the 1980s. And yet there are problems with this. This constitution, while it is enshrining liberal free market ideas, we still have absolute authoritarian power held by the Chinese Communist Party. So the Chinese Communist Party has a lot of political power, especially at the expense of everyday Chinese people, as we're going to see in a second. We are going to see kind of a few variety of problems emerge in China as a result of this liberalization. We are going to see increased corruption, people taking bribes, major leaders of Chinese businesses being involved in political scandals. But we're also going to see massive amounts of poverty. We are going to see basically a business class emerge in China. And this is leading to instances of wealth inequality. There's going to be privatization of welfare programs. Again, with the impact of increasing poverty in China. Especially hard hit are going to be cities in China. We're seeing intense overcrowding. We're going to see also, politically speaking, a lack of democracy. While we have a free market, how free are the people per se? Not very. So the 1980s is going to see a wave of protests by Chinese students, by Chinese intellectuals. So these people are demanding for really two things. They're demanding for more welfare programs, and they're demanding for democracy, more transparent government. And that's what they're demanding at the Tiananmen Square protest in Beijing in 1989. We are going to see a mass rally, a mass gathering of students, a mass gathering of intellectuals and professors, and they're all saying, hey, we should have a more democratic society. We should also have a more equitable society, economically speaking. However, this protest is going to be met by government repression. We see this famous image here of the tank man, a man who is standing in the way of the Chinese military, rolling in their tanks to put down this student protest. And really, these similar problems remain in China, problems of wealth inequality, problems of poverty, problems of a lack of transparency in government. But let's turn our attention now to the so-called Asian tigers of East Asia. These are countries that are going to experience rapid industrial production, largely on more traditional free market lines. So not the mixed economy China has, but more kind of a free market, more of a capitalistic development. So let's look at these Asian tigers in specifically, because they are going to experience rapid industrialization as a result of a few things. For one thing, these countries largely don't have strong welfare policies to protect workers. So we are going to see very cheap labor being exploited in these countries, places like South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. We have cheap labor leading to workers' rights abuses, really. We're going to see the rise of sweatshops in these East Asian countries. But capitalism is flourishing as a result of this cheap labor. On top of that, these governments are going to encourage strong education programs. We are going to see technical education, engineering especially, increase in these East Asian countries. We're going to see also foreign investment by countries like the United States, by Japan. And really, these countries are unique for how rapid their industrial development will be as a result of these three factors that I've identified. And that these countries are also experiencing political repression, much kind of like we're seeing in China to a degree. But it's going to be on the opposite end of the spectrum. These will be right-wing governments that are largely supported, again, by the United States. They are anti-communist governments. South Korea, Taiwan, these places have dictatorships really until the 1990s, 1980s in some cases. So we're seeing kind of not only a transition towards capitalism and industrialism, but we're seeing a transition towards democracy by the 1990s. So we are really seeing a liberal economic transformation in countries like Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. These countries will have very strong automobile industries, steel and manufacturing industries. And we see here, right here, the increased GDP of these nations, the increased gross domestic product as a result of industrialization. So you should be able to identify some changes in East Asia. I would look at kind of political changes as well as economic changes And then more specifically, kind of relating to the daily summary prompt, how is the Chinese economy changing from the 1940s, from a planned economy, towards the 1980s, where we see a more free market economy under state capitalism? Let's turn our attention now to the Middle East. We looked at the Far East, let's look at the Middle East. And really the Middle East is going to be a major zone of conflict between the superpowers of the Cold War, especially in the United States' zeal to prevent the spread of communism. But that's not to say we don't see unique developments in the Middle East. We are going to see the rise of a sort of opponent to both Soviet imperialism and American imperialism. And that is going to be expressed through Arab nationalism. Arab nationalism can trace its origins back to the 1920s, the protest movement against the mandate system. But during the Cold War, largely it is going to be kind of an alternative to the Soviets and the Americans. It is going to stress against the spread of Soviet and American influence, so kind of a protest against imperialism. But it's also going to be a protest against the existence of Israel, as we're going to see. Israel is going to be propped up by the United States even today, largely because of this fear of the spread of communism. Israel, if anything, is not a communist state. It is a pro-Western, pro-capitalist state. But it's viewed by a lot of Arab nationalists as kind of the Americans putting their foot in the door of progress in the Middle East. So there's going to be a lot of anti-Israeli sentiment. There's also going to be a lot of anti-American sentiment as well. That's a major kind of idea of Arab nationalism. But kind of to distinguish it from Islamic fundamentalism, which we'll discuss a bit more later on, it is largely secular. So let's look at some figures of Arab nationalism. For one thing, we have guys like Gamal Nasser in Egypt. He's kind of the early pioneer of Arab nationalism. He is going to nationalize, take over the Suez Canal from the British and the French in the 1950s. He is an example of economic nationalism, this idea of kind of charting a course between the first and the second world by creating an own unique economic ideology, one that is vaguely left-leaning, but not exactly Soviet-style communism. Kind of other figures of Arab nationalism that relate to this so-called proxy wars is going to be figures like Saddam Hussein in Iraq and Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. Hussein is going to actually be supported by the United States for reasons we'll talk about later. For one thing, he hates communism, but he also hates his next door neighbor, Iran, who definitely hates the United States and Israel. So Hussein, before the 1990s, largely going to be supported by the United States for his strong anti-communist views, for his hatred of Iran. But he's also creating sort of his own economic system. He is largely going to institute a policy of socialism in Iraq. But another figure of Arab nationalism who's going to side a bit more with the Soviets is going to be Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. Gaddafi is a strong Libyan nationalist, but he's in favor of more left-leaning movements around the world. He's sponsoring things like Cuba's independence. He is communist revolution. He's sponsoring the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. So we have figures like Gaddafi and Hussein who are being propped up by either the Soviets or the Americans. But then we have kind of a figure who represents the opposition to Israel, and that is a figure of Yasser Arafat and the founder of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which we'll discuss more on the next slide. But he represents this notion of being opposed to Israel and trying to get other countries of the Arab world to back him up against Israel. Other kind of forms of Arab nationalism are going to be political parties that espouse ideas known as Baathism. Baathism essentially has this three-pronged motto of nationalism, so pro-Arab nationalism, of socialism, so strong social welfare policies, but not Soviet-style communism. And finally, the idea of pan-Arabism, the notion of unity, that Arab nations across the Middle East have a common interest, a common political interest against, for instance, the American presence in the Middle East, which is increasing during the Cold War. So let's take a look at Israel and Palestine. Well, Israel is largely going to be supported even to this day by the United States for its strong anti-communist stance. And this is going to really characterize kind of a lot of developments we'll see in the future. So Israel is a product of the Cold War in many ways. In 1948, Israel is founded largely as a result of Jewish immigration from fleeing the violence of post-World War II Europe and the Holocaust. And we are going to see Israel being formed, yet it is being formed at the expense of, well, Arab land. It is being formed at the expense of Palestinian land. Palestinians lived in this region, but then Israeli settlers, they're suddenly here, buying up and in many cases outright stealing the best land across Palestine. So we are going to see almost immediately a conflict emerge between Arabs and Israelis in Palestine. We are going to see the Arab-Palestinian War in 1948. And to kind of protest the continued existence of Israel, we are going to see the Palestinians organize in a military organization known as the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, led by this man in the scarf, as Yasser Arafat. Arafat is going to try and build up alliances with Arab nations across the Middle East to oppose the Israeli occupation of Palestine. And there is going to be a series of wars between Arab nations who are resisting not just the Israelis, but also the American presence as well. That's really kind of how the Cold War is leading to these conflicts. The United States is going to prop up an anti-communist government, Israel, Israel is formed through kind of less than ideal means at the expense of Palestinians. This is increasing Arab nationalism, leading to anti-American hostility, anti-Israeli hostility. So Arab nations, out of this desire for Arab national unity, they are going to support Israel or the opposite. They are going to support Palestine in their efforts against Israel. In 1967, Arab nations like Egypt and Syria, they're going to go to war with Israel in the 6 Days War. Take a guess how long it lasts. Drop a comment down below. But this 6 Days War is going to see Israeli victory. Israel actually occupies Egypt as a result of this war. So we have the 6 Days War as an example of hostility towards the Israeli presence in the Middle East. Israel wins thanks to military support from the United States. In 1973, we're going to have a sneak attack on Israel during the Yom Kippur War. Yom Kippur is a very important holiday in the Jewish calendar. So the Arabs, namely countries like Egypt and Syria, they're going to say, this is a perfect time to strike. So in 1973, the Israelis are going to come under attack by Arab nations, but Israel is going to win thanks to United States support. So to protest American support for Israel, we're going to see Arab nations, primarily those in the organization known as OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, initiate an oil blockade, an oil embargo from shipments going towards the United States. We are going to see an oil embargo that is pressuring the United States to reconsider its relationship with Israel. But the United States can't back down from supporting Israel. Oh, no, no, no. So we are going to see kind of attempts by the United States to stabilize the region. We are going to see in 1978, under Jimmy Carter in the United States, the Camp David Accords. This is going to have Egypt recognizing the legitimacy, the right to exist of Israel. And this is going to kind of inspire other countries of the Arab world to do the same thing. However, this is going to have the impact of reducing the independence movement for Palestine, at least Arab support for Palestine, because they recognize Israel as a real country. And that's coming at the expense of Palestine, unfortunately, for Palestinians. And in many ways, the wars and conflicts between Israelis and Palestinians still going on very much today. Israel continues to occupy land owned by Palestinians. So let's turn our attention, and I have a joke. It's not very funny unless you watch The Sopranos, so I'm just going to skip that joke. And let's turn our attention now to Iran and what's going on there. Well, in the context of the Cold War, let's consider this. In 1953, a socialist by the name of Mohammad Mossadegh, and I'm going to type his name on the screen just so you can spell it out if you are taking notes at this time. So in 1953, we are going to see the rise of a figure known as Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh is a socialist, and a socialist who wants to nationalize the industry of oil in Iran, which is owned by, at this point, Americans and British people. So in this threat of taking over American and British land, British oil production, we are going to see the CIA sponsoring a coup against Mossadegh, leading to the rise of an anti-communist but extremely pro-Western and pro-capitalist man by the name of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The Shah of Iran, as he's known, is going to be an insanely brutal dictator. He especially is going to crack down on communists. He is cracking down on anyone opposed to Iran's support from the United States. The United States' support of Iran. And he is also going to make himself unpopular, not just by being a dictatorship, but also through his attempt to westernize Iran. And that is the the White Revolution. The White Revolution is the Shah's attempt to westernize Iran, but it's going to largely alienate the more traditional aspects of Iranian society. We are going to see an underground resistance movement burgeoning along more traditionalist conservative lines. And that is going to be the Islamic Revolution. What happens essentially is that the Shah is going to go for cancer treatment in the United States. He's let in, and he is going to experience a lot of political chaos at home. There is going to be a Islamic revolution in which a Muslim group of Shia Muslims, they're going to come into power. And really, they are going to promote anti-Western, anti-American, anti-capitalist ideas. They're not necessarily pro-Soviet Union because the Soviets are god-awful secularists. But the imposition of a new leadership in Iran through the Islamic Revolution is seeing the rise of an anti-Western, anti-Israeli government. And the new leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran is going to be this man right here, the Ayatollah of Iran, the supreme religious leader of Iran, a guy by the name of Ruhollah Khomeini. Khomeini is going to be the anti-Western dictator of Iran, the head of a theocracy that's forming in Iran, a government by the religious principles of Islam. And to this day, the Iranians largely feel these feelings of hostility towards the United States, largely for this war that we'll talk about in a second, but largely because of the legacy of the Shah and his very brutal policies. But the rise of Iran is concerning for the United States because it means that there is an anti-Western superpower in the Middle East. So we have to sponsor a government to counteract the impact of the, sorry, I'm trying to get rid of this guy right here. There we go. So we are going to see a US support for an anti-Iranian government right next door to Iran. And that is why the United States supports this man with the mustache, Saddam Hussein. Hussein is going to be a really kind of two things on his checklist that the United States likes. He hates communists, woohoo, and he hates Iran. So he's going to actually be supported by the United States, even though he's really a really terrible dictator. He is going to sponsor a program of genocide against Kurdish people. He is going to have a lot of political corruption. His son goes on live TV and shoots somebody. It's insane, kind of the absolute power that Hussein has, but he's backed up by the United States. In 1980, at the urging of the United States, he's going to go to war with Iran and try and take away Iranian territory. So this is going to lead to the Iran-Iraq war. The US gives Saddam Hussein a bunch of weapons, including things like poison gas and anthrax. And that is what Hussein's going to do. He's going to utilize these against Iranians, kind of at the behest of the Americans to a degree. However, this war is going to bankrupt Iran. Well, yes, it will bankrupt Iran, but it will also bankrupt Iraq in the process. So to make up for the funding, Iraq is going to invade its neighbor to the south, Kuwait. But why is this a problem in the eyes of the United States? Well, the United States is going to also have very close relations with Kuwait. By the 1990s, we've kind of had our fun with Saddam Hussein. Let's move on now to a new government, especially a government that produces a lot more oil than Saddam Hussein ever did. So we are going to see Kuwait being invaded by Iraq in the 1990s. And in response, the United States is going to invade Kuwait and thus Iraq right back in 1991 in the event known as the Gulf War. Saddam Hussein is going to stay in power even after this war, and we're going to take a look at his the impact of 2001 on Iraq later on in our next few presentations. Let's look at another place the Cold War is impacting the Middle East, and that's going to be Afghanistan. In 1979, there's going to be a pro-communist rebellion in Afghanistan. A communist government is going to take power, backed up by the Soviets. But in the 1970s, Afghans are going to resist this communist government. We are going to see a rebellion against the Afghan government. And this is going to lead to the Soviets saying, hey, if we want to restore communism, we have to invade. And that's what the Soviets do in 1979. They are going to invade Afghanistan. And we are going to see the so-called Afghan-Soviet War. However, as a result of the rise of an anti-communist by the name of Ronald Reagan, the United States is going to heavily support this anti-communist movement in Afghanistan. We are going to see the United States, along with its newfound Islamic fundamentalist buddies, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, they're also going to provide troops and support for the Afghan resistance, the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen, these are largely Islamic fighters who are extremely anti-communist, and they are going to fight against the Soviets. But the Soviet-Afghan War is going to have a few impacts on world history, some that are impacts to this day, and we'll see that more later on. For one thing, it's going to kind of be the Vietnam War of the Soviet Union. The Soviets definitely lose. They're going to waste a lot of military resources on Afghanistan. So this is going to accelerate the process of destabilizing the USSR and thus leading to its eventual collapse by the 1990s. But the other long-lasting impact is that the United States is giving legitimacy, literally giving money and backing to Islamic fundamentalist groups in the context of the Cold War. This is going to have the impact of increasing Islamic fundamentalism in the region. That's going to be a major concern after the Cold War is over, something we will discuss more on our final presentation. But we're also seeing, as a result of the funding of the Mujahideen, the rise of an organization known as the Taliban. The Taliban is going to be a major institution that will appear out of the remnants of the Mujahideen. And the Taliban, of course, can have a major presence in Afghanistan until even this day. And then, of course, this is a still from Rambo 3, kind of praising these Mujahideen fighters, because guess what? They're not communists. Doesn't matter they have a 7th century view on the rights of women. So you should consider this question right here. How did the Cold War impact politics in the Middle East? I will be right back. I need to open my door. Sorry. Let's wrap up today by discussing movements for change in the international community. This sort of addresses the last bit, so to say, of the earlier presentation. Of the daily summaries. So we are going to see movements for change, especially in the environmental realm following or throughout the Cold War, I should say. And largely, this is in protest to increasing pollution as a result of post-war prosperity and post-war industrialization. Remember, we're going to see the rise of industrial economies in Japan, in Western Europe, in the United States, in the Soviet Union. This is going to have the impact of creating a lot of pollution in the international community. I mean, it gets so bad in the United States, there's literally a river that gets set on fire, for goodness sake. So we have this problem of pollution. Hello, you forgot that. So we have a problem of pollution, but we also are going to see how the Cold War is going to lead to things like the OPEC embargo that we discussed earlier in this presentation. This is going to largely realize the need to transition away from oil dependency. We are going to see, as a result of the OPEC embargo, a need to move away from oil production. Because if we don't have access to oil from the Middle East, we can't have all of these big, fat, fancy cars like SUVs and Cadillacs and such. So we are going to see calls to make a more sustainable environment in these industrialized economies. We are going to see the rise of environmental movements to protest all of this environmental devastation and pollution. We are going to see the rise of organizations like Greenpeace. We're going to see the rise of anti-deforestation movements, because that's going to impact the third world as well. We are seeing kind of countries attempting to catch up, industrialize in places like Africa and Latin America at the expense of the natural environments. So we're seeing anti-deforestation movements in places like Kenya. We'll discuss this more in our last presentation. But we're also going to see the rise of parties like the Green Party. There are parties, green parties around the world. There's one in the United States, but there's also ones in Germany and across Europe as well. So this is kind of a movement for more equitable environmental policies. That's really what we're seeing in places like the United States and Western Europe. We're also going to see a reconsideration of how the environment is interacted with by humans. We are going to see kind of new ideas of creating more sustainable environments for creating increased access to the bigger food supply. So to meet the demands of a rising population, remember World War II, going to see a huge population boom, these so-called baby boomers. So the boomers are largely going to see more people in the world. Therefore, we need more food. Therefore, we need more ways to produce food. We're going to see the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution largely is going to see increased farming and increased technological ways to farm. We are going to see kind of at the root, literally, we are going to see things like GMOs. We're going to see things like pesticides and herbicides. We're going to see things like improved agricultural methods as well to make the soil more sustainable. So the Green Revolution is an attempt to address the rising population concerns about sustainability. On top of that, we are going to see improvements to medicine leading to longer life expectancies. We have medicines, we have vaccines, we have birth control. We have different things that are leading to longer life expectancies. But of course, these have their own unique environmental troubles of their own. We have problems of sustainability. Is there enough fossil fuels for future generations? Is there enough food? Are we overworking the land during this time? So we are seeing population stresses as a result of these environmental challenges. And finally, we are going to see movements for more equitable distribution of social, racial, and general establishment power. It's open. Yes. Don't appear. So we are seeing kind of movements for more equitable gender and sexual orientation hierarchies. We are seeing the emergence of second wave feminism. The first wave was in the 1920s. Let's get the right to vote. Second wave, let's have social equality between men and women, especially in the workplace. And this is going to lead to a debate between Western and non-Western countries. We are going to see a division between non-Western and Western feminism. In non-Western countries, we are seeing this concern over debates about economic inequality. We are seeing concerns about racial inequality. And we're also seeing kind of, mostly in Western countries, divisions over social roles, basically the household and other kind of areas of gender relations. We're also seeing a gay rights movement, increased acceptance of LGBT people. That's largely going to become more active and militant as a result of the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s. Largely, governments around the world not going to do anything about the AIDS crisis, especially in the United States under figures like Ronald Reagan. So to demand more equitable kind of treatment for gay people, for LGBT people in general, we are seeing a more militant gay rights movement emerging in Western countries. We're seeing movements for racial equality as well, especially in places like the United States and South Africa. We have figures in the US like figures like Martin Luther King Jr. We have figures like Malcolm X. And in South Africa, something we will discuss in our fourth chapter, we're going to see the rise of figures like Nelson Mandela. You can see him on the finger puppet right here. Anyway, Nelson Mandela is going to lead the charge for Black equality in South Africa. And we'll discuss this more later on. In general, there's this feeling of anti-establishment feeling among these baby boomers. They are protesting against the unequal economic systems, the unjust foreign policies. This is the kind of hippie counterculture idea we have of the global 60s. In 1968, there's a wave of protest in the international community, not just in the US, but in places like France, Czechoslovakia as well. So you should consider these questions right here. What are some challenges facing societies during the Cold War? What are some movements to solve these challenges? Thank you for your time watching this video. For those of you who watched, who's your favorite finger puppet that I've showed today? Drop that comment down below. All right, have a great rest of the day. Bye.